Meeting number 132 of the Standing Committee on International Trade, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, May 23, 2024. The committee is resuming its study of the trade impacts of Canada's leadership in reducing emissions. We have with us today from the Canadian Steel Producers Association, Catherine Cobden, President and Chief Executive Officer, Carleton University, Eric Van Rutherven, Instructor and Adjunct Research Professor, and Borden Ladner Gervais Rambo Bihodi, Senior Counsel. Welcome to you all. We will start with opening remarks of up to 5 minutes, please. Ms. Cobden, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everyone. We really appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to share the Canadian steel producers' views on the role of trade measures as part of Canada's climate change response. As this committee is aware, the CSPA is the national voice of the Canadian primary steel industry, as well as some of the largest steel users in Canada. Our 16 members represent 123,000 direct and indirect jobs, contribute $15 billion to the GDP, and have facilities in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. In general terms, carbon trade measures are seen as a tool to level the playing field for domestic industry that face higher costs due to domestic climate policies, and to prevent carbon leakage through shifts to jurisdictions with less environmental regulations. Trade measures should indeed form part of Canada's comprehensive toolkit in the fight against global climate change. That said, these measures can take many forms, and I will share with you some views on two distinctly different approaches that we are witnessing globally around steel-specific carbon trade measures, namely the CBAM in the EU and the product intensity tariff approach being contemplated and under preparation in the United States. The CBAM requires importers to purchase certificates that mirror the net carbon price paid by the EU's domestic industry. The design of the CBAM has major flaws for the EU steel industry, given its accelerated phase-out of free allocations in their carbon pricing regime, as well as a lack of export tax rebates. These concerns far outweigh the benefits gained from having the CBAM in place. Similarly, the Canadian steel industry would share these concerns if CBAM, as designed in the EU, were adopted here in the same manner. Furthermore, Canada has another consideration that warrants careful attention. Basing a carbon tariff on a carbon pricing regime would undoubtedly create trade tensions with our largest trading partner, who does not have a carbon pricing regime. For these reasons, all of these reasons, the CSPA would reject an approach to carbon trade measures in Canada that mirrored the EU's CBAM. Alternatively, the United States has launched a major undertaking through the U.S. International Trade Commission, the U.S. ITC, to establish product-level carbon intensity-based tariffs for steel imports into the United States. Essentially, tariffs would be set for a range of carbon intensities for a range of products and would apply to the import price of the steel, making it very similar to a 232 style tariff regime. And 232 refers to the tariff program, one of the tariff programs in the United States. The U.S. ITC will deliver their body of work to the new Trump administration in February, opening up, in our view, another possible tariff pathway to be pursued by that administration should they choose. It is worth noting that Canada and the United States steel industries, have comparable carbon intensity levels for steel products. According to a third-party benchmarking study conducted by the Global Efficiency Intelligence consulting firm, our respective intensities are many times lower than offshore steel producers, particularly those with a track record of unfair trade, China, Turkey, Vietnam, and many others. The CSPA would be happy to submit this benchmarking study to the CIIT for your reference if that was deemed of use. I'd like to remind the committee that 50% of Canadian steel production is exported to the United States, while only a negligible amount is shipped to the EU, around 0.1% of all exports. So to be clear, market factors as well as the overall carbon performance levels suggest that climate tariff alignment with the United States would be far more favorable to than one between Canada and the EU. Furthermore, a carbon tariff approach coordinated with the U.S., if it could be arranged, and that's a big if, would provide another opportunity to strengthen what is already one of the strongest trading relationships in the world. Further, our critically important efforts to align trade policy with the United States, and from tariffs on Chinese steel products to requiring country of melt of all of our imports to the many trade cases launched by the industry, Canada is on its way to demonstrating with real proof just how serious we are in protecting our respective markets from unfair trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On to Ms. Van Riethofen, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, members of the committee. It is a great privilege to be here. I'm going to avoid the technical details of CBAM and focus on the bigger political picture. I want to suggest that there are a series of global shifts that help explain the emergence and significance of CBAM. These shifts suggest that not only is CBAM here to stay, but that we will see more carbon tariffs in the future. And this matters for Canada because it points to a high level of political and economic risk. What do I mean by that? I mean that the day may come when it becomes good politics to punish climate laggards like Canada. And CBAM represents one step closer to that day. And this committee, as well as other Canadian political leaders, needs to have a serious conversation about how to prevent that from happening. So very quickly, what are these global shifts? The first is the normalization of protectionism. In the 1990s and the 2000s and part of the 2010s, the orthodoxy was that you liberalize trade. Now that orthodoxy is on the back foot. Trump's tariffs are a good example of this. When he said he was going to put a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, what surprised many of us was the 25%, not that he was using tariffs because they have become normalized as part of Canadian trade policy. The second shift here is that concern about climate change is growing around the world. And I discussed some of the polling data in my written statement, but the summary is this. Other countries increasingly see climate change as a major problem, and they want their governments to do more. The third shift here is that other countries are increasingly suffering extreme climate events, and these countries are often our trading partners and our allies. So whether it is the United States or Spain or Germany or anyone else, what we are seeing is a rising number of mass casualty events that can cause billions, if not tens of billions of dollars in damage. The fourth and final shift I'd point to here is an uncomfortable truth. But Canada is a climate laggard. And I'm not saying that we should dismiss Canada's climate successes, and there have been many successes. But when you compare Canada to other countries, and in particular our G7 peers, we are not doing well, and the gap is growing. So what do these changes add up to? My concern is that they add up to a scenario where other countries look at us and ask why Canada, a rich and prosperous country, is not doing more. And there is a very real risk here that other countries who are making sacrifices to fight climate change and who are suffering extreme climate events are going to be angry and resentful at those who free ride on their efforts. And this anger and resentment is going to create strong political incentives to punish free riders. And at this point, the rhetoric around Canada's climate leadership will matter little. And the prevailing sentiment will be, make the bastards pay. That is the scenario that concerns me. How do we avoid this? We avoid this by taking credible action on climate change that closes the gap between us and our peers. And we can talk about what that looks like today, but I would suggest doing something soon, because right now, CBAM is designed to gently push countries towards climate action. In the future, it may not be so gentle. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Bahodi, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before you to discuss trade and climate change. Let me start by introducing myself. I will then give an overview of two issues raised by the title of your study, Reducing Emissions and Trade Impacts. I will conclude by talking about Canada's leadership. My name is Rambo Behboudi, and I'm senior counsel at the law firm of Borden Ladner Gervais. For the last 32 years, my practice has focused on international trade law and policy. As trade lawyer, diplomat, and negotiator for the Government of Canada, I had the privilege of negotiating key multilateral environmental agreements that advanced and protected Canada's interest in respect of trade in chemicals, control of pesticides, and genetically modified organisms. I was also engaged for over a decade in trade litigation in defense of our natural resources and agriculture sectors. In private practice since 2017, I have advised developed countries and NGOs on deforestation, plastics, and other climate change measures, and developing and less developed countries on trade liberalization. I now turn to the first of the two substantive issues, reducing emissions. Why should we? Simply because if we go on as we have been going on, the human contribution to climate change will likely transform the planet in a way that we, humans, are not capable of dealing with. The planet will go on, of course, and so will some of us. But as things are, we're looking into the abyss. And so we have to change the way we do things. Qu'est-ce que cela signifie en termes commerciaux?
What does this mean in business terms? In the world of trade, we talk about win-win scenarios. And I'm here to tell you that if we play our cards right, and Canada has an excellent hand, we have every reason to believe that we, our trading partners, and the planet will all come out winners. Here are two important concepts worth mentioning.
The first is externalities. Imagine your neighbor in the middle of major renovations, and he dumps all of the construction debris on his front lawn. An eyesore, and possibly a health hazard, if, like me, you're allergic to dust. You go to him to suggest that perhaps the debris should be landfilled, and he replies, "It's my front lawn, and you know how much landfilling costs?" We call that a negative externality, where economic activity, a good thing in itself, gives rise to costs imposed on others. Uncontrolled carbon emissions are like the debris in the front lawn. Now, no one is saying ban construction, but we should expect that the person creating the debris will have it removed and assume the costs. Il en va de même pour le deuxième concept.
The same applies to the second concept, carbon pricing. If you, as a consumer, knew the real impact of carbon emissions, you'd be careful about your consumption habits. In a free market, such as ours, prices are the best way to convey information to the consumer and shift costs to where they need to be paid. We can all do this at home, but we know it's not enough. That's where the commercial impact comes in. When the prices associated with producing goods in one country are high, due, for example, to carbon pricing, entities often begin to consider offshoring for commercial purposes. The result is an increase in carbon leakage, i.e., the relocation of production to an exporting country with less stringent climate policies and carbon pricing systems. This doesn't help, not trade, not the environment, and not the legitimacy of climate change measures.
This is how we arrive at border carbon adjustments. They've been mentioned, and we can discuss that later. In my remaining time, let me turn to Canada's leadership. Canada is very trade exposed. It's in our interest to ensure that the global framework for carbon pricing functions well. How? Abroad, we must remain engaged and active, leading by persuasion and by example. At home, That's the example. Judicious deployment of domestic and trade policy can ensure our exports remain competitive internationally. A homemade carbon pricing framework, along with appropriate border adjustments, may be the most effective mechanism to forestall or offset all, or at least most, of the carbon costs associated with trade. Thank you again for inviting me today. I will be happy to answer your questions.
Right. Thank you very much to the witnesses. I'll now open questions. Dan, the floor is yours for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to be here. My questions will be for Ms. Cobden. Obviously, as an MP from Hamilton, where it's steel town, we appreciate the work that the Canadian Steel Producers Association does. I know that, of course, our friends in Alcom are instrumental to the steel industry as well, so a nod to them. You indicated that 50% of our exports are to the U.S. and 0.1% to the EU. So maybe you can elaborate as to what you see as the trend line going forward. I know there are a number of different things that could impact that, but are we intensifying or?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, and always great to connect with an MP from Hamilton. The discussion around the EU CBAM and, of course, the threat of tariffs coming out of the United States continues to raise a question about whether the Canadian steel industry can grow market share in Europe. And so I just want to put, and I sort of hear that as well in your question, trend lines. We don't anticipate significant growth in the European market for Canadian steel. And the reason for that is multifold, but there's a large existence of overcapacity in the world, and they're already well into the European market, as well as they have their own domestic producers. So we don't see growth in the EU, so that 0.1% is likely to stay about that. And by the way, that goes back as a trend line for the last several years or many years. It's not a new phenomenon. As far as the U.S. goes, I think a lot of that is unknown at this point. We do require and rely on access to the U.S. market for 50% of our production. That is by far and away our most significant priority. And so we maintain that is needs to be. So that trend has been around some time, and we hope it continues into the future.
Thank you. So obviously the Canadian and U.S. steel industries are quite integrated, which we know, and thank you for elaborating on that. So in terms of, the Canadian Steel Producers Association has raised alarm bells, of course, about our competitiveness and the increase in our carbon costs versus competing jurisdictions. So the carbon tax in whatever form that is, some comments on the impact of that on the Canadian steel industry.
Yeah, so before we had a carbon price, the steel industry was suffering in our competitive position when we had to compete with unfair traders, people that were dumping into our market. Now we have the added problem of trying to compete with fair traders like the Americans, who are very prevalent. They represent 40% of our import share, and we're competing with them, and they do not have a carbon price. So at $80 per ton of CO2 emissions that we now face, that makes a significant difference. And of course, the issue is that carbon price will continue to rise year over year by $15 per ton. So that just intensifies the competitiveness challenge.
And so, I know that the Canadian steel industry has made significant progress in terms of the greening of steel, and we've heard about that. And so I'd be curious to hear your reaction to some of the comments from the other two witnesses, given what has already been accomplished by the industry here.
Yeah, I can only speak, of course, for the Canadian steel sector, who I'm very proud of, and I hope you all are as well. In partnership with the federal government and the provincial government, we have decarbonization projects that will result in 6 million tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. Those projects are globally significant and, frankly, nationally relevant in terms of our overall greenhouse gas emissions from the country, let alone the sector.
Right, but I think the comments from a couple of the other witnesses here were that obviously Canada is a laggard, and that's going to come back to bite us. And I'd be curious to see if you agree with that, or or could comment further on that.
Well, what I'm trying to say is, from the perspective of the Canadian steel producers, we are doing very well on a global stage with respect to. But that doesn't mean that the pathway for the rest is going to be easy. So, but nonetheless, we have a good jump onto the reductions from this sector, and that's really all I can speak to today.
Sure. So you indicated that obviously with every increase in the carbon tax that's coming, and I think as you indicated in your opening statement as well, obviously the U.S. doesn't have that, and so that's going to widen the gulf in terms of our competitiveness. And given the integration of our industries and the importance of the U.S. Market to us as Canadian steel producers, how concerned are you about that, or how concerned are your members about that?
Yeah, our members continue to be highly concerned. At this point, we have asked for a freeze to carbon pricing rises, as well as stringency and trade exposure protection reductions, because we are facing already, and I think all sectors are at different points, but it's been well documented by the Canadian Carbon Competitiveness Commission that steel is one of the most significantly at risk under the carbon pricing regime. And we, underline that by calling for a freeze on price and stringency for a period of time, because we don't have the solutions. We're doing solutions that we can do, hence the 6 million tons, but we need additional solutions, many of which are outside of our control. An example of that would be green hydrogen access at scale, or clean electricity across all of the country.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sheehan for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. And yes, the other steel towns, Sault Ste. Marie, and home to Algoma Steel and Tenaris Tubes, very significant employer in our community, and as well as in Canada. And to your point, Algoma itself exports 50% of its steel into the United States. And we did take some bold action, to reduce the carbon that our steel industry, and not only in Sault Ste. Marie, but in Hamilton, we're producing. In the Sioux, we were first to announce $420 million, which is going to be generational. Because I always mention at committee here, when I was first elected, Algoma Steel was in bankruptcy, and Tenaris Tubes had a handful of people. Tenaris is now 800 people, for example. And Tenaris has always been, and we've been investing in modernizing it and producing less carbon for quite some time. So the question to you, Catherine, is, how can we, leverage the fact that our steel exports are some of the greenest around now? When this project is completed, Algoma, 70% less carbon produced, like taking 1 million cars off the road. How can we leverage that with the EU under their CBAM framework? And I'll let the other witnesses actually take a stab at it too.
Yeah, well, I wish we could leverage it further for us in the EU. As mentioned in my response to Mr. Muse, we don't predict more access for Canadian steel in the European market. We find it a very interesting proposition, though, for the U.S. And should this new administration be interested in, who knows what it would be branded as, Terry, but perhaps, or for foreign pollution tariffs or that sort of thing. But that's some of the new terminologies we're hearing from this. But one of the ways we can leverage this is by working with the United States, given that to your point, our CO2 emissions are really some of the best in the world, as are the United States. This gives us a great opportunity to work together on this challenge, and using it as another instrument to combat what we're always talking about, which is the overcapacity in steel that's creating such havoc for Tenaris, for Algoma, for all of our, I don't want to start naming them because I'll have to name 16 member companies, but anyway, you understand. And so that's I think, a core task at hand.
Thank you. Now, I'll let Eric take a stab at it too. Just because we're showing such leadership, and just the overall trade arrangement with the EU, how can we leverage what we've done with steel to reduce our emissions? Because I think one of you in the testimony talked about some leadership that we have to show on fighting climate change.
Thank you for your question. I think the point that I want to clarify is that, yes, Canada does have climate successes, and I think my colleague here has pointed to a very important climate success for Canada's steel industry. What I'm talking about is Canada as a country. When you compare carbon emissions to our G7 peers, we are quite a bit behind many of our peers. We are dead last in the G7. I don't think I should presume to speak for the steel industry in relation to CBAM, though, so I'm going to back away from that one.
Fair enough. Catherine, and then when you started talking about what's everyone knows is the elephant in the room is China and its overcapacity. And a lot of people, we haven't discussed this a lot, the melt and pour, the anti-circumvention, because we've done anti-circumvention before in previous budgets. Could you please explain how melt and pour works for the record, and how that is helping reduce some of the dirtiest steel ever made?
Excellent. And if I may, also highlight the Section 53 tariffs. Section 53 tariffs, you mentioned bold action. I think Canada, with everybody around this table support, by the way, took bold action against China with tariffs set at 25%. And that was super helpful, not just for that problem, but also for convincing our U.S. colleagues that we do take this issue very seriously. On top of that, you add in the melted and poured, which just went into effect on November 5th. This gives transparency to a supply chain that is fraught with unfair trade, much needed transparency. So melted and poured is underway. We need to ensure fast execution, but it's underway. And finally, anti-circumvention. We have a framework. It was announced in a few budgets ago. I can't remember the exact timeline. However, we do feel that there is opportunity to strengthen the anti-circumvention framework and do more. And we want to do that both for our domestic market considerations as well as, again, aligning with the United States to say we're not the problem here.
Right. And then what happens, since we have you here, if the United States increases its tariffs on the Chinese steel? Would you suggest that we also increase tariffs to stay lockstep with them?
Yeah, so as a general philosophy, we think we should keep pace with the United States. Now, that being said, we're hoping to do this on an analytical base. So the tariffs came into place on October 22nd. We'll know in the next, how long will it take to develop a trend line? 6 months or so, how effective they're being. And then we will, whether the U.S. does this or not, we may wish to open up a conversation about, are the tariffs high enough? I will remind you that the U.S. not only has their 301 tariffs at 25%, but they also have 232 tariffs at 25%. So in a lot of cases on steel, they're tariffing China at 50%, and we're at 25%. So we're not yet sure whether 25% is sufficient, but we do recognize it as a bold step forward.
One of the things that, yeah, okay.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay, please, for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci à l'ensemble.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your presentations. I would like for us to start. Ms. Cobden, you weren't able to finish your answer to the previous question, and so I would like to ask you to finish your answer because we wanted to know whether or not tariffs were high enough, and you stated that we don't know yet, but before we talk about solutions, we have to talk about issues, and you're confirming that environmental standards for steel production in China have nothing to do with North America.
Yes, thank you very much. Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for the question.
In fact, we can confirm through, again, third-party consulting studies, not our own, that Chinese emissions are much, much higher in steel than in Canada and in the United States collectively. So essentially, when we're allowing China into our marketplace, not only is there a job erosion issue because they're dumping steel and it's an unfair trade practice, it also so happens that we're importing a high amount of carbon emissions that are essentially part of their of their production processes. So this is, again, it speaks to the importance of our various tools to prevent carbon leakage and also to address unfair trade because they're intricately linked in the steel sector.
Donc là, on est dans la proposition.
So we're talking about tariffs because of dumping, but also because of the impact of steel produced in lower environmental standards could be problematic. And so that's why we look at things this way. If we look at carbon tariffs at the border that would be functional, what would be your recommendations for the federal government? We're talking about a system that wouldn't be in contradiction with our international agreements. Could we implement such measures?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of work to be done for the, as far as the World Trade Order or the World Trade Organization goes, there's work to be done for them to better incorporate climate considerations. But our view is we could do climate tariff work at our borders, and that essentially we can do them in a manner that is consistent. And we should do them in a manner that is in collaboration, if possible, with the United States. We don't want to take any more actions that create trade tensions between Canada and the United States for reasons I've described, the integration of our economy, tariffs harm both sides of the border, amongst allies, that sort of thing. So that would be our sort of approach.
Monsieur Riethoven, Van Riethoven.
Mr. Van Riethoven, currently with CETA and CPTPP and CUSMA, there are measures so that we cannot weaken ecological measures. And the government has stated that current measures should stop carbon leakage. But do you believe that measures in agreements could cause delocalization and leaking for certain companies?
I thank the member for the question. I'm not sure I quite understood the end of it. I think it was about agreements and their effects on carbon leakage. I think my more general statement today would be that the political environment globally is changing, and that not only are our countries going to adopt these particular climate measures to reduce their emissions, but there's going to be a broader political incentive. They're going to be much more appealing to domestic audiences.
Merci. Comme il me reste une minute, j'aimerais...
I only have 1 minute left, and so I would like to take advantage of the time that I have to read a motion that I sent into the committee last Friday. That, considering the 22 service interruptions were noted during the first month of operation of the Canada Border Services Agency Assessment and Revenue Management, CRM, portal, some of which extended beyond 3 hours, and that the service standard during the first 4 weeks remains below the 99.9% target set by the Canada Border Services Agency. Considering the numerous shortcomings reported by stakeholders, including errors in calculating duties and taxes, difficulties in making payments, inaccuracies in statements of account, problems logging on or registering for the portal, and an increase in the level of unexpected recourse to workarounds to manage the system since its implementation, considering the high level of dissatisfaction expressed by stakeholders, revealed, among other things, by the survey conducted by the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters among its members, the results of which, forwarded to the members of the committee, highlight an inability to reach the help desk to resolve problems, and a lack of knowledge of the CBSA staff, hampering their ability to provide adequate support. Considering that all the stakeholders who testified before the committee, with the exception of the agency, have been sounding the alarm for several months, and again in September 2024 about the system's technical problems and the lack of training and consultation with stakeholders, and that these witnesses repeatedly contradicted or denied the assertions made by agency representatives when they appeared before the committee on March 19th and September 25th, 2024. Considering that the initial budget allocation for the CRM was $371.5 million over 10 years, and that as of December 31st, 2023, the CBSA had already disbursed $556.8 million, an amount that has continued to rise in 2024 and will continue to do so in view of the numerous deficiencies to be corrected, and considering that the development of the CARM portal was initiated 14 years ago and that the agency has postponed the implementation of its platform 3 times since 2021, the committee recommend that the Auditor General conduct a performance audit of the CBSA's development and maintenance of the GCRA, including the roles and responsibilities of suppliers and subcontractors. And I would like for us to discuss this now, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Savard Tremblay. The floor is now open to debate your motion, or since we have scheduled committee business at the last 15 minutes, could we defer it and debate it and so that we can continue with our witnesses? What's your desire?
J'ignore en fait le temps.
I'm not sure how long the debate will take, so it depends on everyone's comments. If everyone is in agreement, I believe that we could move forward quickly on this.
Mr. Johns?
We at the NDP supports this. We think that this is pretty straightforward, writing a letter, making this request. So hopefully we can just vote on this and move forward.
Mr. Williams?
Yes, we agree as well. This is something we warned was going to happen when we discussed this at committee. So certainly we support these steps going forward to get this rectified.
Okay, so it's the will of the committee then that we deal with this issue. My apologies to our witnesses, just a bit of patience here. And so I will refer it back to the clerk for a recorded vote.
Sure. So if the committee is ready to take a vote on the motion. Pardon me.
Can I make a question?
Of course.
I'm going to be, is everybody in agreement with the motion? So we don't need to waste any time. No. Right? We are the most efficient group you'll find here, Mr. Mize, so welcome to our group. And it's in agreement, so the motion passes.
On peut quand même faire un vote par appel nominal.
We could still do a vote if we'd like.
Well, it's a question of time. We've got our 2 witnesses, and we have another panel of witnesses coming, so it's adopted.
Madame la Présidente, ça prend environ.
Madam Chair, it only takes about 30 seconds.
Okay, well, Madam Clerk, Mr. Clerk.
Perfect. Madame Fortier.
Oui.
Mr. Sheehan.
Oui.
Mr. Zuberi.
Yes.
Mr. Mao.
Yes.
Mr. Badaway. Mr. Williams.
Yes.
Mr. Mears. Yes. Mr. Martel. Mr. Genereux. Monsieur Savard Tremblay.
Oui.
Mr. Johns.
Oui.
12-0. That's it.
Nobody in opposition, so that was dealt with fairly quickly.
Vous voyez, c'était court, Madame la Présidente.
You see, it took no time at all.
Absolutely, but we didn't debate it at all. But that's the will of the committee, and we're fine. Mr. Johns, it's your floor now for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's great to be joining the committee today. I'll start with you, Ms. Cobden. We know that Canadian steel is manufactured in a much less carbon-intensive way than the dirty steel that comes from other countries like China and India. Can you talk about how Buy Clean policies could help support the Canadian steel industry?
Thank you very much for the question. Absolutely. It would be a really strong opportunity for Buy Clean policies for the steel sector if they would be adopted in Canada. It's also, fully compliant with all the, the trade order, the WTO, et cetera. So we would and do ask for Buy Clean to be part of the comprehensive toolkit on climate change. But as of yet, we have, I think, steps towards it, but not steps that work for the steel sector yet.
One element of the U.S.-Canada steel dispute is that the U.S. accuses Canada of being a backdoor to Chinese products. They say our anti-circumvention framework isn't working. Can you speak about how could we fix Canada's anti-circumvention regulations, and how would this help with our relationship with the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I mean, the first thing we should all tell the Americans when they say we're a backdoor to China is that we have introduced tariffs, Section 53 tariffs. All parties supported this to stop Chinese, to introduce a 25% tariff on Chinese imports. That is huge. We also introduced melted import, also important. Then the third and final piece to be done, and that must be done, is to improve the anti-circumvention legislation. While we have a framework, the domestic industry is communicating very clearly to everyone that it's not sufficient and does not meet the test of the United States. So there are several legislative changes we'd like to see take place, and we're happy to submit those to the committee.
I'm going to go to you, Mr. Behaboudi. First, thank you for your testimony, and I know this isn't steel related. I come from a forest community on Vancouver Island in Port Alberni, and the federal government highlighted in the 2023 Fall Economic Statement that the opportunity to, for Canada to leverage the economic and environmental benefits of waste biomass conversion for heat and energy, noting that it's a high potential decarbonization pathway. And as the Canadian forest sector weathers significant market headwinds, particularly, like I said, in my home province of BC, extracting more value from forest biomass will offer significant opportunity for forestry workers and communities, yet the government's been dragging its feet. We know biomass as a source of carbon neutral energy has the potential to provide Canadian electrical grids with a sustainable and reliable source of energy, while creating high-paying jobs for rural and remote communities, and also includes the displacement of emissions-intensive forms of energy used to power our communities, while reducing the vulnerability of our forests to devastating fires. Can you speak about how timely the passage of these ICTs are as part of the Fall Economic Statement? And certainly we know that industry stakeholders have grown deeply, concerned about the long delays of the passage of this implementing legislation, recognizing that Canada's competitors in the United States have had a 2-year start with the passage of the IRA, which includes similar investment tax credit provisions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones, for your question. I'd just like to say that I began my career in steel, defending the industry against unfair trade, and spent a great deal of time in my career defending the softwood lumber industry in British Columbia. So it's your question it brings me happy memories, both professional and personal. The short answer is we should be doing everything yesterday. The challenge we have in Canada is not just access to the U.S. market, which is always under some sort of stress. We heard just yesterday President Trump saying that Canada is being subsidized to the tune of $100 billion and so on and so forth. This is on top of all the tariff threats. So there's that angle, and the other thing that we obviously have to worry about is the subsidies measures in the United States. So on the one hand, our access to the U.S. is under threat. On the other hand, our competitiveness in the U.S. and globally is under threat as a result of these measures. Which says to me that even though we have obviously very limited capacity to constantly compete with U.S. subsidies, we really do need to be alive to those challenges, and where we can, match them.
Thank you very much. 27 seconds.
Well, just thank you. And this is really important to Catalyst Paper Mill in Port Alberni, and to workers in the forest sector where I live. And I hope that the government will move rapidly in following through with their promise from last year's FES. People are losing their jobs. We lost a mill last week, sawmill in our community. And I'm really hoping that the federal government will move with urgency.
Thank you. Mr. Martel for 5 minutes, please.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. My question is for Ms. Cobden. I would like to know what the impact of carbon pricing was on the competitivity of the steel production sector in Canada.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, there's been an impact already at $80 per ton. It is a cost on our business that many other jurisdictions in our marketplace that we're competing with every day for the sale of steel that they do not face. So indeed, it is, I think, imperative for us to recognize that we are not living in a system that's homogeneous. Different countries have different approaches, but our approach is putting competitive pressure on the steel industry. It's, I think, at different, as I mentioned before around this Q&A, I think different sectors are at different stages of pressure. The steel industry is at the bleeding edge, if you will, of pressure under the carbon pricing regime.
We know that steel is one of the exportations from Canada that is the most exposed to tariffs at the border. Do you have any internal projections for the potential impact on the Canadian steel industry?
Should the U.S. impose 25% tariffs on the domestic steel industry, the answer is this will have a devastating effect. In 2018 and for a year starting mid-2018, we had 25% tariffs on the industry. Every one of the CEOs that are on my board are very clear that that is extraordinarily devastating. The point I would add is that I think we have the opportunity in steel particularly to remind the Americans of how the 25% tariff also deeply affected their side of the border. It does harm on both sides when you have such an integrated economy as we do in steel.
Oui, Madame, c'est intéressant.
That's very interesting. Companies in your sector, are they ready to absorb the additional administrative costs linked to the implementation of the BCAs? Would it be a burden to these companies?
Well, I guess it would depend on how the BCA is prepared. So I don't talk about CBAM, but more of the carbon trade measure, however it's designed. I've been quite clear in my opening statement that CBAM would not be a design that would serve us well, and we are categorically opposed to it, if I may say. But there are ways to design it that would be effective, and also particularly effective if we are coordinated with the United States. So we support the idea of carbon trade measures as long as we are, to your point, not designing them in a way that's extremely challenging, like the CBAM, and also, and not just or, but and aligned with the United States.
How much time do I have left? I have another question.
Catherine, encore.
Again, Ms. Cobden, what challenge do you see in collaboration between Canada and the EU to ensure harmonization of mechanisms like CBAM and the Canada carbon pricing?
Well, so we're in an interesting situation where our climate policies are most aligned with the EU, but our market, at least in steel, is most aligned with the U.S. So our situation is complicated because, as I've already described, it's not a matter of just shipping more steel to the EU. That is not a market that's open to us, and we don't foresee that happening. So we must maintain the U.S. market access, and we must protect our domestic market. Those are two things we must do. But the carbon pricing regime, as I said, is not aligned with the U.S. regime. We've already been discussing the IRA. We have some, IRA type of tools here, but not all of them, and certainly not the same way. And we have, strong alignment with the EU, but they're not our market.
Merci.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Martel. Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I want to dig a bit deeper on the how to the what, and that being levers that we can put in place to actually open up more cooperation with the United States. Obviously, with the regime that we have in place here in Canada with respect to carbon pricing aligns with the regime that the EU has, and for the most part, it prevents a lot, I'll call, border taxes, pollution taxes at the border to not occur, which is a good thing. Otherwise, we'd be paying those tariffs, and quite frankly, it would cost us more if we didn't have the regime in place. But as you noted, Ms. Cobden, the U.S. doesn't have that regime in place. And what I'm particularly interested in, especially going forward with the negotiations and discussion, I won't call them negotiations yet, I'll call them discussions, with the U.S. and specific to China, with them being a high emitter of carbon, and other countries, and not, by the way, just about steel, about all products. Do you find that there's an opportunity to work closer with the U.S. to share this same regime in our discussions moving forward to strengthen our collective international trade performance and use it as a mechanism to compete more competitively against China, number one? Again, putting these carbon trade measures in place with the U.S. And again, not just with steel, but all product, to then therefore make the markets more robust for both Canada and U.S.
That's what we hope. Again, we can't predict the future. Our stance at CSPA, and this is, confirmed, basically by all of the leadership of the steel sector across Canada, is that we need to demonstrate the best and prepare for the worst as it pertains to Canada-U.S. By demonstrating the best, it's doing exactly what we've been doing and to maintaining that trajectory. So the Section 53 tariffs, which protects our domestic, does two things. It helps us domestically, but it also demonstrates the positive to the U.S. The melted and poured tool that we've been describing, the anti-circumvention changes that we still have yet to do, and certainly if there is any sort of opening on a foreign pollution tariff or some other,
wider
pollution measure at the border that the U.S. starts to signal, it would be our hope that we would step into that fulsomely and discuss and describe and negotiate with the U.S. one that's like a North American or at least a Canada-U.S. approach to this problem to do exactly what you're describing. Okay. So we really hope that we do that.
Thank you, Ms. Cobden. Mr. Biboudi, same question.
In principle, given that the U.S. is our main market for these and many other products, 75% of our exports go to the U.S., of course, we need to be aligned to the extent possible with the U.S. market framework. The challenge we have is as I mentioned, is that security of access that we have to the U.S. market is not guaranteed, is no longer guaranteed. Ms. Cobden referred to the 2018-2019 232 measures. Now, we managed to get out of that. We managed to negotiate the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement. But the hope was that we would be able to move beyond that, now that the agreement is in place, move beyond that. But what we're facing since then is, number one, under the Biden administration, we weren't hit with tariff measures. We were hit with a $400 billion subsidy framework, which we then had to match. So that in itself creates a framework that is challenging for Canadian businesses. Now, with the new president, with President-elect Trump, we have, even before he comes into office, threats of tariffs, 25% for whatever, and then just yesterday, as I said, there was another discussion about subsidizing Canada because of the trade deficit. So that security of access isn't there, which suggests to me that while in principle it's good to align ourselves with the U.S., it is perhaps time to start looking outside to other markets and try to develop other markets. And now this is something that is really up to the private sector, not for governments to do. But we really do need to pay close attention to the fact that that market, that secure access that we've had to the U.S. market may not be something that can continue.
Thank you, Mr. Biboudi. And I'll say this in conclusion to Ms. Cobden. If I may, I'd like to connect in the future to, in fact, put a strategy forward for those discussions with the U.S. and all those that are given testimony today. Okay. I'd appreciate that involvement. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses. We very much appreciate your valuable information. We will suspend as we have to switch for our other witnesses to come on board because they're video conference. So we will suspend. The meeting back to order. Thank you very much. We have with us today now the Citizens Climate Lobby, Andy Kubrin by video conference, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, also by video conference, Aaron Cosby. Welcome to you all. Mr. Kubrin, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please. Mr. Kubrin?
Yes.
Okay, please, you
I'm
have the
here.
floor.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, and honorable members of the committee. My name is Andy Kubrin. I'm a writer, researcher, and climate activist based in Calgary. I volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby Canada and the Calgary Climate Hub. Through my work with Citizens Climate Lobby, I learned about a policy called a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. As you're no doubt aware, it's a new development pioneered by the European Union. Last June, along with other Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers, I briefed my Member of Parliament, Mr. Shivaloy Majumdar, on the topic. Later, I wrote an article about the European Union's CBAM and Canada's National Observer. The CBAM is basically a tariff levied on the embodied carbon in imported products. It has two purposes: to protect domestic producers from unfair competition from cheap carbon-intensive imports, and to encourage other countries to implement their own carbon pricing policies. No one likes taxes, but with proper design, this one can be a tax worth paying. The CBAM can level the playing field of international trade, promoting clean production everywhere. It can also lower emissions, which puts the brakes on global warming. I won't try to describe all the complexities of CBAMs here. You have expert witnesses who can help you with that. But I will tell you that CBAMs pose a significant challenge to Canadian exporters and to the nation as a whole. And like many challenges, this one comes with an opportunity. International trade makes up about 2/3 of our GDP. Our top trading partners are the United States, China, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Mexico. But if you total the trade with our individual European partners, the EU as a whole is our second or third largest trading partner, depending on which source you consult. The EU introduced its CBAM in 2023 and began requiring importers to submit data on the embodied carbon in specific high emissions products. In 2026, importers will start paying tariffs on the carbon content of these goods. The program will gradually expand until 2030, when it will cover all goods in the EU's emissions trading system. Other nations are following suit, including our top partners. The United States is considering various policies. The United Kingdom expects to have a CBAM in place by 2027. Australia, Chinese Taipei, China, and India are also weighing their options. These countries are following Europe's lead for a reason. The European and United Kingdom CBAMs, and perhaps others under development elsewhere, provide a rebate for carbon pricing already paid. In this way, a CBAM becomes a virtuous circle, rewarding countries that reduce their emissions while discouraging free riders. It turns carbon pricing into a competitive advantage. There are a few ways Canada can take advantage of these developments. One is to adapt our own carbon pricing system to capture the rebate available under CBAMs. That could mean modifying the output-based allocation currently available under our output-based pricing system. Our exporters would still pay a carbon price, but the revenue would remain in our economy instead of going to other nations. The other thing we can do is to implement our own CBAM. We would, of course, price the greenhouse gases in goods that we import to discourage carbon-intensive production in other countries. Revenues raised under our CBAM would be used to benefit Canadians. This step would protect Canadian industry and encourage other nations to do their fair share in emissions reduction. These choices entail risk and trade-offs, and I defer to the experts who will advise you on these matters. A changing trade environment presents you with a challenge and Canada with an opportunity. It's a big challenge, but I'm confident your study will identify the best solutions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, sir. On to Mr. Cosby, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Aaron Cosby. I'm a senior associate with the Winnipeg-based International Institute for Sustainable Development. I also chair the Canada-based Commission on Carbon Competitiveness, and I've worked for almost 15 years in Canada and internationally on the subject of border carbon adjustment. That sounds sad, actually, including about over a dozen reports on the specific elements of the EU CBAM. So I'm going to speak to you today on two themes. First, on the context for this session, which I'm going to argue is in fact a broader reality than just the EU CBAM, that should compel us to focus on these questions. And second, about the ways in which Canada's industrial carbon pricing regime, the OBPS, relates to that broader reality. So first, the context. The EU CBAM, as you've heard, is now in effect. They'll start levying charges on an increasingly stringent scale from 2026 to 2034. It is the first border carbon adjustment, or BCA regime, to come into effect, but it will not be the last. The UK has already announced that it will have one in place as of 2027. Australia is in the final stages of consultation on whether it should have a similar mechanism. Chinese Taipei actually has one in law, but not yet enacted. And critically important, given that our energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors export overwhelmingly to the U.S., there are 4 different bills before the 118th Congress in the States that propose some type of border climate-based charge. And several of those bills will be introduced in the next Congress. Some look like they may find bipartisan support. But moreover, it's not just a matter of border carbon adjustment. BCAs are just one of a suite of measures in the coming green wave that will restrict trade based on the carbon content of goods. Look at the EU's methane regulations, which will affect any gas exports. Look at the Buy Clean standards in the US public procurement. Look at deforestation-free product rules coming in the EU, proposed in the UK and the US. These are all relatively recent measures. It's worth asking why the sudden rush of such policies. It is an inexorable trend. It starts with increasingly serious climate change impacts, which translates into increasingly serious climate change policies worldwide. And when countries increase their ambition, they need to think about the competitiveness of their domestic firms, vis-a-vis firms in other countries that don't face the same climate regulations. And that leads us to trade-related climate measures. So this is not a static situation, it's a trend. We will see more such measures. Why does this matter to Canadian exporters? I mean, to state the obvious, it means that in our first, third, and fifth biggest trading partners, measures are being implemented or contemplated that are going to punish producers of industrial goods with large carbon footprints, number one. And number two, that will reward national policy efforts to price carbon. Let me break down those two dynamics a little bit. First, the more GHG intensive is our production of steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, the more those goods are going to be charged at the border of any country with a border carbon adjustment or some other such measure. Now, fortunately, as Catherine Cobden has already told you and others, at the moment, our production of goods like steel and aluminum are relatively clean. But the incentive still exists. Even for our clean producers, the more they can reduce their GHG intensity, the less they're going to pay. And second, measures like the EU and the UK CBAM are going to grant credit at the border for a carbon price paid in the country of export. So let me turn to how Canada's existing industrial carbon pricing, the OBPS, relates to all that. It helps in both respects. First, it provides incentives to reduce the industrial GHG pollution in those firms, which will lower the border charges payable for Canadian exporters. Second, it lowers the border charges again because Canadian exporters will have already paid a carbon price, and they will be credited for that. Now, just to be clear on an important detail, the credit that the CBAM is going to offer will not be the full federal backstop price. I mean, to protect our firms against carbon leakage, the OBPS has output-based allocation, which lowers the average cost of carbon paid by the carbon firms. It's likely that that much lower average cost is going to be what gets credited. In closing, let me reiterate, we're going to see many more such measures, similar to the EU CBAM, that restrict trade based on carbon content of goods. And our existing industrial carbon pricing scheme helps our exporters prosper in a world full of such measures, both by helping them reduce their GHG emissions and then therefore face lower charges, secure more markets, and also by lowering the charges that are due to them based on the credit for a carbon price already paid. Thank you. I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Genero for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses for joining us here today. So we had some testimony last week that again highlighted that the adjustments were first promised in 2020, and then they were in the Liberal Party platform in 2021, and then there were public consultations in 2022. Mr. Cosby, were you consulted as part of those consultations in 2022?
I did submit formal comments on those consultations, yes. And informally, I have consulted with a number of senior bureaucrats on what the shape of a border carbon adjustment might look like in Canada. As well, we produced a report that I was lead author of that tried to dive more deeply into what a BCA for Canada might look like. A couple of reports, actually.
Okay, so the answer, you were consulted. Mr. Kubrin, were you consulted as part of those consultations on the policy in 2022?
Pardon me. Thank you for your question. No, I was not consulted.
So, Mr. Cosby, have you seen the results of those consultations from 2022?
We haven't. The government has yet to issue any response to the consultations they undertook.
Did you have any speculation as to why?
My speculation, and of course it is speculation, is that through those consultations, the government understood that border carbon adjustment in Canada would be an incredibly complex tool to implement, and moreover that it would have to be, and I believe Ms. Cobden also made this point, done collaboratively with the United States in order to be a workable tool for Canada. That's not an easy prospect. Moreover, let me speculate one more thing. The existing systems of protection under the OBPS, that is output-based allocation, are sufficient at the moment to protect the competitiveness of firms against carbon leakage. That may not be the case in the medium term and the longer term, but at the moment, the government, I don't think, sees an urgency to implementing something like a border carbon adjustment, given the complexity that would be involved in that challenge.
So again, this was promised in 2020, and again promised in 2021, consultations 2022. Mr. Cosby has not seen any results from those consultations. And I just, for you, Madam Chair, back to the witness that we had before us from, I believe it's from the Finance Department, hoping to get those documents that what those consultations look like, in which he nodded in agreement to at the time. So I'll go back to you first, Mr. Cosby. Then how important do you think that any future border carbon adjustment policy is to harmonize with that of the United States?
It's critical. As Mr. Barbouti mentioned in our previous testimony, 75% of our exports go to the United States. Moreover, any unilateral trade measure that Canada puts in place that affects U.S. exports to Canada is going to be met with a typical response from a trade partner which is infamous for its retaliatory capacity. So, in plain language, if you put something like this in place without the cooperation of the United States, you screw up an intensely integrated flow of trade in goods back and forth across this border that would have negative implications for both countries.
And same question to you, Mr. Kubrin.
I don't have the global view of trade that my friend Mr. Cosby has, so I think I'll pass on that. I don't think I can add anything of value to this current question.
You don't have any opinion on if this border carbon adjustment should harmonize with that of the United States?
Oh, I do believe we need to harmonize with United States trade, but that's just a general view. I don't have the global knowledge of trade to say more than that.
So then, if we're not, if the incoming president does not have this on his agenda, and we are here studying it with the potential recommendation to move forward on it, you would be in disagreement that we should move forward on a border carbon adjustment policy, Mr. Kubrin.
I believe that we will need to adapt our trade policy to the United States and also to policies pursued by many other nations. And I am going to just say that I do not know that the sole correct answer. It is a complex question. That's all I can say, but I thank you for your question.
Okay. All right, Madam Chair, I'm good.
Very much. On to Mr. Sheehan.
And I'll be sharing my time with Vance as well, Chair. To the witnesses, could you inform the committee what industries might benefit from CBAM? We've heard from the industries that have trepidation, but what industries would benefit from the CBAM? And I'll just turn it over to you. Start with Aaron, perhaps.
So the Commission on Carbon Competitiveness that I chair just released a couple of reports, the first of which tried to understand which industries in Canada were at most risk of carbon leakage, and those would be the ones that would be likely best protected by CBAM. We came out with a list of industries that included iron and steel, aluminum, cement, nitrogenous fertilizers, pulp and paper, conventional oil and gas, oil sands, and petroleum refining. Of those, we gave it a sort of a red light, yellow light, green light rating. The ones most at risk of leakage and therefore most likely to benefit from a Canadian CBAM were iron and steel, nitrogenous fertilizers, basic chemicals, and I'm sorry, I think I forgot to mention them the first time through, pulp and paper, with cement as a sort of an honorable mention, yellow.
I'll share my time with Vance now.
Thank you, Mr. Sheehan. Mr. Cosby, I want to get a bit more into the weeds, a bit more granular on your comments with respect to utilizing a CBAM type regime with the U.S. and, of course, with that put in place, how we would actually strengthen our collective international trade performance. Mr. Trump has been on record to state that he looks at tariffs as being a method to raise his finances over on the U.S. side. The unfortunate part about it is a lot of that will be reliant upon his own people being taxed on the products he would actually put tariffs on. This can very well be a mechanism for him to achieve the same goal, but the only difference being is that a lot of those tariffs would be otherwise then paid for by those folks across the globe. Can you comment a bit more on a direction that we can take in dialogue with the U.S. to, in fact, collectively, in that vein that I just spoke about, to collectively strengthen our international trade performance, working closer together versus working further apart?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and it's top of mind for folks in this space. Look, the U.S., the incoming administration, as you said, favors tariffs as their first go-to tool, first, second, and third, really. And moreover, we don't expect to see a carbon price in the U.S. anytime soon. So any approach that tries to harmonize our approach with that of the states has to take into account those two fundamental starting points. I think where there may be some hope is in terms of imposing at the border agreed standards for GHG intensity of products. So no steel allowed into Canada, into the United States that was produced at a GHG intensity above X. No cement, right? This provides, and moreover, you could combine that with an element of the current bill before Congress, the Clean Competitiveness Act, that would potentially allow steel into the border above that standard, but charge for it. So there you have a way to accede to the penchant of the incoming administration to put in place charges at the border. A system like that could work well as in combination with Canada's OPPS. It could work well in the States because it doesn't depend on having an existing carbon price for which you need to adjust. And it does satisfy the geopolitical urges of the U.S. to ring fence China and keep out high intensity steel from some of their trading partners, including China.
Now, Canada right now, because of the ratified trade agreements that we put in place since 2015, has an economic population of over 1.3 billion versus our population of, say, 38 to 40 billion or million. With that, do you find that when we look at the trade agreements that we have in place, the regimes that are in place with these different countries that we do have trade agreements with, do you find that advantageous in our discussions with the U.S.?
I don't. I wish I could say I did, but the inclination of the U.S. administration, and it's not just the incoming administration, it's the U.S. administration over the last several terms, has been increasingly to disregard the multilateral system of trade rules when it suits them. They are increasingly a mercantilist nation, thinking of U.S. first, in what I would argue is a short-sighted view, but that doesn't allow for much of an advantage in the kind of integrated trading system of which Canada is a part in the way that it should.
Okay, thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for both witnesses, and you can decide who starts. In 2020, there was a preliminary report on a price on pollution and stated that for leakage and competitiveness, that tools and policies used in Canada in carbon pricing have succeeded in controlling certain risks. The report stated that with the price on carbon increasing to $170 per ton by 2030, additional measures could be necessary. I would like to start by asking you what you think about that report. Thank you.
C'est pour qui ça?
Tel que mentionné au début.
As I stated, it's for both witnesses.
Whoever would like to go first. Mr. Cosby?
Moi, je peux commencer.
I can start.
I would agree with the findings of that report, that the existing mechanisms for protecting against carbon leakage are adequate. And those mechanisms, to be clear, are the standards, the sectorally set standards within the OBPS, below which there is no carbon price due. So if you meet the standard, you pay nothing. And if you exceed the standard, you do have to pay. You still have this marginal price, this high marginal price, which incentivizes you to reduce your emissions. But your average price, your average cost of carbon is nice and low. So the existing system works well. As you go out to $170 a ton, and as you have a tightening of those standards, we've put in law a 2% tightening of those standards, you start to lose that benefit. My recommendation, and the recommendation of the Carbon Competitiveness Commission, Chair, is that for those sectors that are most at risk of leakage, and not all sectors are equally at risk of leakage, but for those that are most at risk of leakage, you need to maintain a high standard, a very generous output-based allocation in those sectors. You still have the nice high marginal price, you still have the incentive to decarbonize, but you got to keep the average cost of carbon low in those sectors. And moreover, in the medium to long term, you need to be thinking about something like a border carbon adjustment or GHG intensity standards at the border for reasons I'm happy to go into in further depth. But for now, the output-based allocations work.
Monsieur Kubrin, maintenant.
Mr. Kubrin?
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for the question.
I do not have anything to add, though, so I respectfully cannot add any more. Thank you.
Ceci dit, ben, autre question.
And another question for both witnesses. Are there trade partners other than China to Canada that have GHG policies or environmental policies that are very different from ours that we should implement border carbon adjustment measures in place?
Bon, je peux commencer.
I can start.
It's not so much really a question of the policies of the countries that are exporting to us as it is the actual GHG intensity of the firms in those countries that are exporting. So if I look at Indian steel, for example, Indian steel is extremely GHG intensive. The policies in India are not so bad, but it's just the fact that they use more blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace production, so very high intensity steel. And when we do put in place, if we do put in place measures at the border that are designed to keep out that kind of steel, I strongly believe that it should not be focused on the policies of those countries, but the effect of those policies. Is the steel clean? Right? That's the fairer way to proceed, because there may be very clean producers within countries that have bad policies. You don't want to punish those producers.
Seconds.
Monsieur.
I don't know if Mr. Kubrin would have anything to add.
Thank you for your question, but I have nothing further to add.
Donc, encore une fois, si...
So again, for both witnesses, we know that Mr. Trump, during his first mandate, had canceled over 100 environmental laws, and during his second mandate, he was talking about abolishing the Inflation Reduction Act and legislation on 90% of carbon capping for certain industries. How could this impact the trade relationship between Canada and the United States?
Encore, je peux commencer.
I'll start.
Si vous voulez. There's a good and a bad in this. And the short-term good is that a lot of the incentives offered under the Inflation Reduction Act have been drawing investment away from Canadian clean technology and clean production processes toward the United States. So if you abolish all those incentives at the state side, you start having a greater availability of capital in Canada to invest in green technologies, green productions. That's the short-term benefit. The longer-term cost, of course, is that if you have huge investment like that going into solutions like industrial heating and heat pumps and decarbonized steel, those solutions that are developed as a result of all that investment spill over into other countries as well. The United States is not hermetically sealed. We benefit from the lowering of costs that take place as a result of all that investment. So it is a good story and it is a bad story.
Si monsieur voulait ajouter autre chose.
Does Mr. Kubrin have anything to add?
Thank you very much. Mr. Johns, please.
So I normally don't sit on this committee, but my understanding is a few weeks ago that this committee heard from Quebec foresters that the forest fires caused by climate change have had a much bigger impact on their operations than the U.S. Softwood lumber tariffs. Maybe, Mr. Crosby, can you speak about the cost of climate change? And I will highlight that this morning I met with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and they cited that the top concern from small business right now is rising insurance costs due to climate change is what's provoking that increase. And it went from being the 55% of small business concerns to now 74% of small business concerns. So we know that this is impacting small business as well. Mr. Crosby, if you'd like to comment.
You know, we're venturing outside my area of primary expertise, but I never hesitate to step onto a soapbox. I think the Canadian Climate Institute has done excellent work that tries to quantify the costs of climate change to Canada specifically, and those costs are staggering. And they consist of not only, as you have said, costs of rising insurance for businesses and for homeowners, right? the direct costs of natural disasters, the cost of lost livelihoods, and I'm coming to you from British Columbia. The mills that are shutting down in interior British Columbia are shutting down, at least in part and in large part, because of a lack of supply of timber, and it's from forest fires, wildfires, and it's from pine beetle, both of which are exacerbated by climate change. So, climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's fundamentally an issue about the economic security of our country. I think that's why we're here. That is the urgency that impels the measures like carbon pricing in Canada and in the EU, and it's what gives rise then to those border measures that try to make those measures more possible.
Understanding the importance of the green transition, do you believe that Canadian firms that export environmental and clean technology goods and services be prioritized for participation in Canada's trade missions and programs? And if so, to which countries or regions should their participation in trade missions be prioritized? And back to you, Mr. Cosby.
I strongly agree with that. I mean, we know what our centers of prosperity are in Canada currently and historically, and that's going to change. I mean, climate change changes everything. So we are going to see a rise in, increasingly a rise in the centers of sectoral excellence that give rise to prosperity in Canada. We already have more workers involved in renewable energy technologies and clean technologies than currently are employed in the fossil oil and gas sector in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So and that trend is going to continue to increase. So yes, we need to focus on those areas that can bring us prosperity in the future, in the global green markets of the future, because we're responding to the climate change policies of countries around the world when we think about what's competitive in our export streams. Those future centers of excellence should be part of our trade missions, as well as receiving fundamental support from the Canadian government to foster their competitiveness. And if I'm thinking about where you want to make those missions, not probably to our traditional partners, that would be the United States. I'm thinking more in terms of Asian and primarily Asian, but also European customers.
You're joining us from BC, and I don't know if you heard the first panel, but I'd asked a question around ITCs in terms of the last year's fall economic statement around biomass and leveraging the economic and environmental benefits of waste biomass to convert for heat and energy and a high potential decarbonization pathway, and also to mitigate forest fires. Can you speak about the importance of that, given that the U.S. is already doing this in their IRA and they're a couple years ahead of us?
Now we are really outside my area of expertise, and I have non-expert concerns about the use of biomass in that way, just because I'm concerned about the sustainability of the base. But if it can be sourced sustainably in a way that doesn't impact the biodiversity and regenerative capacity of our forests, I think that's a sector deserving of our support. And ITCs are obviously one of the instruments that we should be using in that respect.
Mr. Kubrin, we've heard testimony today on how new climate regulations could affect Canada's international trade, but the impacts of climate change are much more than just regulations. Can you speak about the moral imperative of humans to address climate change?
Thank you for your question. Yes, I believe it's an overwhelming moral imperative, that we all have an overwhelming moral imperative to address climate change. Our entire way of life, our economy, our health, livelihoods, our very lives are at stake. We must act. Thank you.
That's the conclusion of round one. We have to do some committee business, so I will suspend so that we can go into camera. So thank you to our witnesses, very much appreciated, and I move suspension.